They weren't his last words, but convicted murderer John Hanson testified, hoping his last days weren't quickly upon him. I don't want to make life.
At precisely 2 p.m. on June 12, 2025, John Fitzgerald Hanson closed his eyes for the final time inside Oklahoma's sterile execution chamber. 26 years after a routine shopping trip became a nightmare, justice arrives with clinical precision. The story began at Tulsa's Promenade Mall on a sweltering August afternoon in 1999. Two men carjacked 77-year-old Mary Bowles from the parking lot, driving her to an isolated dirt pit near Owasso, where trucking company owner Jerald Thurman was picking up a load of dirt. What happened next would shatter two families and expose the labyrinthine delays that can plague American capital punishment. On August 31, 1999, Mary Bowles spent the morning volunteering at St. Francis Hospital, continuing a routine that had defined her retirement years. The 77-year-old former bank executive approached each day with the same methodical precision that had characterized her professional career. After completing her volunteer duties, she drove to Tulsa's Promenade Mall for what should have been a routine afternoon errand. Mary represented the best of her generation, a woman who had built a successful career in banking when few women held executive positions, then dedicated her retirement to serving others. As a retired Tulsa banker and former St. Francis Health System Auxiliary president, she embodied the quiet philanthropy that strengthens communities. Her afternoon schedule was predictable, her habits steady, her presence in the mall parking lot as ordinary as the Oklahoma heat that shimmered off the asphalt. 20 miles away, near Owasso, Jerald Thurman was conducting business at his dirt pit operation. The trucking company owner had spent decades building his reputation on reliability and honest dealing. Jerald Thurman, the pit's owner, was there loading a dump truck for a delivery when his routine intersected with tragedy. Like Mary, he had no reason to expect that August 31st would be anything other than another ordinary Tuesday. The convergence began when two desperate men made their way to the Promenade Mall. John Fitzgerald Hanson and Victor Cornell Miller weren't random criminals. They were predators who had chosen their hunting ground with calculated precision. The mall's expansive parking lot provided both opportunity and cover, while the afternoon heat kept many potential witnesses indoors. Hanson and Miller kidnapped Mary Bowles from the Promenade Mall in Tulsa in the late afternoon of August 31, 1999. They drove her in her car to an isolated area around a dirt pit near Owasso, where Jerald Thurman's presence would seal both their fates. The brutality that followed defied comprehension. Hanson took Bowles and made her lie in a roadside ditch, where he shot her multiple times. When Thurman witnessed this execution, he became the second victim of a crime that had spiraled beyond its original scope. The shots that ended Mary's life echoed across the isolated pit, forever changing the landscape of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The summer of 1999 had been particularly unforgiving to John Fitzgerald Hanson and Victor Cornell Miller. What began as petty theft and minor infractions had escalated into a dangerous spiral of increasingly desperate criminal acts. By late August, both men found themselves backed into corners of their own making, their options narrowing with each passing day as debts mounted and patience from various unsavory creditors wore thin. The mathematics of their situation had become impossible. Drug habits that once seemed manageable now consumed every dollar they could steal or con. The easy marks were getting harder to find, and their reputation in Tulsa's criminal underworld had shifted from opportunistic hustlers to unreliable desperates. Promenade Mall represented everything they lacked: prosperity, security, and most importantly, vulnerable targets with valuable possessions. The sprawling 4-2 men who had run out of options, the mall became a hunting ground where opportunity met their willingness to cross any line. Mary Bowles emerged from the mall's air-conditioned sanctuary into the oppressive Oklahoma heat, her routine shopping complete, her thoughts likely focused on the simple pleasures of retirement. She had no way of knowing that 47 minutes earlier, Hanson and Miller had positioned themselves strategically, watching, waiting, selecting their victim with the cold precision of apex predators. Her careful steps across the sun-baked asphalt triggered a sequence of events that would transform a routine Tuesday into the final chapter of two innocent lives. The carjacking itself lasted mere minutes, but those moments contained an entire lifetime of terror for Mary Bowles. Forced into her own vehicle, she became a passenger to her own destruction as the men drove toward Owasso, their initial plan already evolving into something far more sinister. When they reached the isolated dirt pit where Jerald Thurman was conducting his routine business, fate sealed the tragedy. Thurman's presence transformed him from innocent bystander into inconvenient witness. And in the twisted logic of men who had already crossed into darkness, witnesses represented problems that required permanent solutions. The remote location that had seemed perfect for disposing of evidence suddenly contained two people who could identify them, two lives that stood between them and escape. The executions that followed were not crimes of passion, but calculated eliminations. The isolated dirt pit, chosen for its remoteness, became an execution ground where moral boundaries dissolved entirely. The morning of September 1st, 1999, brought with it the kind of bureaucratic chaos that transforms routine police work into a multi-jurisdictional nightmare. What had begun as two separate missing person reports, Mary Bowl from Tulsa, Jerald Thurman from Owasso, suddenly converged into a double homicide investigation that would stretch resources across county lines and challenge every assumption about random violence in suburban Oklahoma. Ballistics analysis would eventually reveal that both victims died from gunshot wounds, but the scattered shell casings and tire tracks told a story of coordination rather than spontaneous violence. Blood spatter patterns suggested execution-style killings, while the remote location indicated premeditation that extended beyond simple robbery gone wrong. 3 days after the bodies were discovered, someone who knew more than they should have contacted the Tulsa police tip line. The caller's information proved devastatingly accurate: names, vehicle descriptions, and details about the crime sequence that only participants could have known. Within 48 hours of the anonymous tip, John Fitzgerald Hanson and Victor Cornell Miller found themselves surrounded by a coordinated law enforcement response that had tracked them across state lines. Their arrest in Arkansas came not through dramatic confrontation, but through the methodical police work that transforms tips into warrants and suspicions into evidence. For the families of Mary Bowles and Jerald Thurman, the arrests marked not an ending but the beginning of a legal process that would stretch across decades, testing their faith in a system designed to provide closure, but often delivering only prolonged uncertainty. What had seemed like swift justice following the convictions and death sentences of John Fitzgerald Hanson and Victor Cornell Miller had transformed into an endless labyrinth of legal procedures that consumed years with each filing. The straightforward path from conviction to execution had become a maze where federal courts intersected with state authority, creating delays that stretched justice beyond recognition. By 2003, the mathematics of legal appeals had become a cruel equation. Direct appeals that once took months now required years to resolve. Habeas corpus petitions multiplied like legal hydras, each challenge spawning new procedural requirements that demanded fresh hearings, additional testimony, and expanded court calendars. The families who had expected closure within years found themselves trapped in a system where justice delayed had become justice denied through bureaucratic attrition. The bureaucratic machinery that was supposed to ensure fairness instead became an instrument of prolonged suffering for victim families. 26 years after the murders, the legal process had consumed more time than the victims had lived. Court dates were scheduled and postponed, execution dates were set and stayed, and hope for closure became a commodity rationed by federal judges who had never known Mary Bowles or Jerald Thurman. The afternoon of June 12, 2025, brought with it the suffocating weight of institutional finality that had been building for 26 years. What had begun as a double murder in a dirt pit near Owasso was about to conclude in the sterile precision of Oklahoma's execution chamber, where protocol would transform human vengeance into clinical procedure. By 1:30 p.m., the mathematics of execution had reduced a man's final hours to predictable intervals. Prison chaplains offered spiritual comfort to a man whose soul had been measured and found wanting by 12 jurors decades earlier. The witnesses assembled in their designated viewing area, some there to represent the victims' families, others to ensure the state's actions were witnessed and recorded for history. The clinical precision of lethal injection stood in stark contrast to the chaotic violence that had brought everyone to this moment. Where Mary Bowles and Jerald Thurman had died in terror and confusion, Hanson would die in carefully controlled circumstances, his vital signs monitored by medical professionals who had sworn to preserve life. The irony was not lost on those who had followed the case through its endless appeals and delays. The same system that had failed to prevent his crimes would execute him with meticulous care. "Tell my family I love them." Hanson's final words echoed in the witness chamber, a statement that somehow managed to be both deeply human and utterly inadequate. The families of his victims sat in silence, their own words of love for Mary and Jerald having been spoken at gravesides decades earlier. The lethal drugs flowed through 4 lines with pharmaceutical precision, and at 2 p.m., the man who had destroyed 2 families closed his eyes for the final time. The execution of John Fitzgerald Hanson marked not the triumph of justice, but the exhaustion of legal options, a distinction that offers little comfort to those who had waited decades for this moment. In the end, the story of John Fitzgerald Hanson reveals the fundamental tension in American capital punishment, the desire for finality confronting the reality of process, the need for closure battling the machinery of appeals, and the human cost of a system that has forgotten that justice delayed is justice denied to those who mourn the innocent dead.